What happens when a retired Air Force pilot boards a commercial flight, seeking nothing more than a quiet journey, and finds herself thrust into the heart of a high-stakes crisis? Monica Reynolds has spent decades mastering the skies, navigating turbulence both literal and figurative. But on this day, she faces a storm of a different kind, one that will test her leadership, her resilience, and her ability to rise above the assumptions and doubts of others. When severe turbulence throws a routine flight into chaos, Monica is forced to step forward, not as a passenger, but as the leader she has always been. Tensions boil in the cockpit as she clashes with a captain reluctant to relinquish control, even as the plane hurtles toward potential disaster. Yet, amid the storm, unexpected moments of kindness and trust emerge, altering the course of their journey and their lives. This is a story about navigating turbulence, not just in the air, but in life. It's about the power of trust, the courage to confront biases, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing your worth. As Monica faces the storm, she discovers that even in the most chaotic moments, small acts of connection can pave the way for transformation. Monica Reynolds adjusted the strap of her leather duffel bag as she stepped into the bustling terminal of Logan International Airport. The rhythmic sound of rolling suitcases and muffled conversations filled the air, a symphony of travel Monica had not experienced since her retirement from the Air Force 2 years ago. She glanced up at the high ceilings and the directional signs that hung above the crowded walkways. Despite the chaos around her, Monica moved with a calm precision that belied her years as a pilot. She wore a simple outfit of dark jeans and a tailored blue button-up shirt. Her short-cropped hair framed her face, highlighting the quiet confidence in her dark brown eyes. At 46, Monica had achieved what few could. She had spent 20 years in the skies, flying combat and transport missions for the United States Air Force. Her career had been filled with challenges, from navigating unpredictable weather patterns to commanding teams under pressure. Now she found herself in a new chapter of life, adjusting to the stillness of civilian routines. The thought of visiting her sister and niece brought a small smile to her lips. It had been months since their last reunion, and she could not wait to see 8-year-old Olivia's beaming face. The idea of a quiet weekend spent baking cookies and playing board games felt like a much-needed reprieve from her current reality. Monica had been grappling with the uneasy transition from a life of structure and purpose to one of uncertainty. While her military career had given her a clear sense of identity, civilian life often left her questioning her place in the world. Still, she refused to dwell on the discomfort. She had faced turbulence before, both in the air and on the ground, and she knew how to stay steady. As she approached the first-class check-in counter, Monica noticed the agent behind the desk. The woman, in her early 30s, wore a crisp uniform and a practiced smile. Monica caught the subtle flicker in her gaze, a quick up-and-down assessment of her casual attire and her weathered bag. It was the kind of glance Monica had encountered many times before, one that carried unspoken assumptions. "Good morning," Monica said, handing over her ticket and ID. Her voice was steady, polite. The agent hesitated for just a fraction of a second before her smile widened, though it did not quite reach her eyes. "Good morning. May I confirm your seat in first class?" Monica nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "That is correct." The agent scanned the ticket, her movements efficient, but betraying a hint of doubt. Monica felt a familiar tightening in her chest, but chose not to acknowledge it. She had learned long ago that engaging with such moments often drained more energy than they were worth. After a few clicks on the keyboard, the agent handed back Monica's documents. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Reynolds." "Thank you," Monica replied, tucking her ticket into her pocket. She adjusted her bag and walked toward the security checkpoint. The line for security was long but moved steadily. Monica observed her surroundings with the keen eye of someone trained to notice details. To her left, a family of 4 debated the logistics of their vacation. Ahead of her, A business traveler in a tailored suit scrolled through emails on his phone. Behind her, two middle-aged men whispered to each other, their conversation just loud enough for Monica to catch snippets. "First class, huh?" one of them muttered, his tone tinged with skepticism. "She doesn't look the part." Monica kept her gaze forward, her expression composed. Years of experience had taught her how to remain unbothered by such remarks, but that did not mean they did not sting. She tightened her grip on her bag and focused on the task at hand. Once through security, Monica made her way to the first-class lounge. The serene atmosphere was a stark contrast to the bustling terminal outside. Plush chairs and warm lighting created an inviting space for travelers to relax before their flights. Monica approached the receptionist, a young woman with a friendly demeanor. "Welcome, Ms. Reynolds," the receptionist said after scanning Monica's boarding pass. "Please make yourself comfortable. Let us know if you need anything." The genuine warmth in the woman's voice caught Monica off guard. She offered a polite smile and nodded in thanks before choosing a seat by the window. As she settled into the chair and opened a book, she felt the faintest hint of relaxation wash over her. Moments like this reminded her that kindness, no matter how small, could make a difference. Her brief reprieve was interrupted by the boarding announcement. Monica gathered her belongings and made her way to the gate. The crew greeted passengers with cheerful professionalism, but Monica noticed the captain standing among them. He was a tall, middle-aged man with salt-and-pepper hair and an air of authority. His uniform was immaculate, and his eyes held a sharpness that suggested he was accustomed to being in charge. When Monica handed her boarding pass to the gate attendant, she felt the captain's gaze linger on her. It was not an overt stare, but a subtle scrutiny that felt both dismissive and assessing. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, the captain's voice followed her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone measured but carrying an edge. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Monica paused and turned to meet his gaze. "Yes, I am." The captain's eyes flicked to her boarding pass, which she had placed on the tray table in front of her seat. His lips tightened slightly before he responded, "I just wanted to ensure there was no confusion." "There is none," Monica said evenly, her voice calm but firm. For a moment, the captain seemed taken aback by her composure. Then, with a tight smile, he added, "Enjoy your flight." Monica nodded once and turned back to her seat. She could feel the weight of other passengers' eyes on her, their curiosity and silent judgments palpable. As she adjusted her bag under the seat in front of her, she took a slow, deliberate breath to steady herself. This was not the first time she had encountered such interactions, and it would not be the last. Yet, the quiet resilience that had carried her through so many challenges in the past would carry her through this moment as well. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its taxi to the runway, Monica looked out the window. The early morning sky was painted with soft hues of gold and blue, a reminder of the beauty that awaited beyond the clouds. For Monica, the open skies had always been a place of freedom and possibility, a sanctuary where she could rise above the noise of the world below. Little did she know, this flight would take her on a journey far beyond the physical, challenging her in ways she had not anticipated and teaching her the true power of resilience and kindness. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane gained altitude. Monica gazed out the window, her fingers lightly drumming against the armrest. The soft palette of the early morning sky stretched endlessly, a view she had witnessed countless times from a cockpit. Here, as a passenger, the perspective felt strangely detached. She glanced around the first-class cabin. The passengers had settled into their seats, the quiet chatter of conversations mingling with the faint rustle of newspapers and the soft clinks of glasses as the flight attendants served refreshments. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit sat upright, his focus on the tablet in his hands. His earlier glance in Monica's direction had carried the same unspoken doubt she had encountered at the check-in counter. Monica's thoughts drifted to the captain, whose lingering gaze and patronizing tone still hung in the air. She knew men like him, men who equated authority with control, who struggled to acknowledge that competence could come in forms outside their expectations. Her years in the military had taught her how to navigate such dynamics, but the effort always left her with an undercurrent of frustration. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Monica looked up to see a young flight attendant with a pleasant smile and kind eyes. She wore her uniform with a neatness that mirrored Monica's own attention to detail, and there was a subtle warmth in her demeanor that set her apart from the detached professionalism of her colleagues. "Just water, please," Monica replied. The flight attendant nodded and quickly returned with a glass. "If you need anything else, just let me know," she said, her tone genuine. Monica offered a faint smile. "Thank you." The interaction was brief, but it lingered in Monica's mind. Kindness often showed itself in quiet, unexpected ways, ways that reminded her there was still room for connection, even amid tension. Monica sipped her water, her focus returning to the view outside. The plane had leveled off, and the clouds below formed an unbroken white expanse, their soft edges kissed by golden sunlight. This was the kind of peace Monica sought on her flights. Yet, as much as she tried to relax, she could not shake the nagging unease that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Her attention shifted as the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming passengers and giving a brief update on the flight. His tone was smooth and deliberate, but there was an unmistakable note of pride that seemed to amplify with each word. "For our first-class passengers," he said, his voice carrying an air of superiority, "please let us know if there is anything we can do to enhance your experience." Monica raised an eyebrow at the phrasing. It was subtle, but the tone struck her as less of an invitation and more of a reminder to conform to certain expectations. She leaned back in her seat, brushing it off as another display of the captain's character. As the flight continued, turbulence began to ripple through the cabin. It started with a light shudder, one that barely stirred the passengers. Monica noticed it immediately, her finely tuned instincts alerting her to the plane's subtle shifts. She glanced out the window, observing the darker, more defined edges of the clouds. Turbulence like this was not uncommon, but something about the pitch of the engines and the plane's adjustments caught her attention. Her grip on the armrest tightened as her mind began to analyze the possibilities: wind shear, a shift in atmospheric pressure, or even mechanical strain. The turbulence grew more pronounced, jostling the passengers. A collective murmur rose in the cabin, accompanied by nervous glances and a few stifled gasps. Overhead compartments rattled faintly, and the seatbelt signs dinged on with sharp urgency. Monica's muscles tensed as she instinctively adjusted her posture, aligning her body with the plane's movements. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice returned, still smooth but noticeably more controlled. "We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We expect to be through it shortly." Monica frowned. The captain's phrasing felt designed to reassure the passengers, but to someone with her background, it carried an underlying note of concern. She could sense it in the slight hesitation before his words and the calculated choice of phrases. The plane jolted again, harder this time, eliciting a few cries from the passengers. Monica looked around, her eyes landing on the man across the aisle. His earlier confidence had given way to visible tension as he gripped the armrests tightly, his gaze darting between the window and the seatbelt sign. The flight attendant who had offered Monica water reappeared, moving swiftly through the cabin to check on passengers. Her professionalism was unwavering, but Monica noticed the faint edge of nervousness in her movements. Monica leaned slightly into the aisle as the attendant passed. "How are things up there?" she asked, her voice low but steady. The attendant paused, her eyes meeting Monica's. There was a flicker of recognition in her expression, as though she sensed that Monica's question was more than casual curiosity. "The captain and crew are handling it," she replied. Her voice was calm, but Monica caught the subtle strain beneath her words. Monica nodded. Choosing not to press further, she watched the attendant move on to reassure other passengers, her quiet kindness a steadying presence amid the rising tension. The turbulence continued, and Monica's instincts grew sharper. She recognized the signs of a situation escalating. The uneven pitch of the engines and the plane's jerky movements hinted at deeper challenges, a storm system perhaps, or equipment under strain. Her gaze shifted to the cockpit door, a small but significant barrier between her and the situation unfolding on the other side. She could not ignore the growing sense of urgency. Years of training and experience demanded action, but she was just a passenger on this flight. The authority was not hers to wield. Still, she knew when to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that the flight crew might need help. Monica took a steadying breath, her mind already calculating her next steps. She would wait for the right moment, but she would not remain silent. Not when lives depended on it. As the plane lurched again, Monica tightened her seatbelt and prepared herself. She could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. She would not let their doubts or the captain's assumptions stop her. If there was one thing Monica Reynolds knew, it was how to rise above the clouds, both literal and figurative. And she was ready to do it again, no matter the odds. The plane jolted harder than before, causing a ripple of gasps to sweep through the cabin. Monica instinctively pressed her hands against the armrests, her muscles tensing as the plane dipped briefly before leveling out. Overhead, bins rattled loudly, and one popped open, spilling a travel pillow onto the aisle. Monica's gaze shifted to the flight attendant, Laura, who was helping a passenger secure their belongings. Laura's calm demeanor hadn't faltered, but Monica could see the strain in her expression. This was more than a routine bout of turbulence. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, calm but clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering stronger turbulence than anticipated. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're adjusting our route to find smoother air." Monica's jaw tightened. Adjusting course mid-flight was not a decision made lightly, especially at cruising altitude. It indicated conditions were worse than the captain had initially let on. Her gaze returned to the window. The clouds had thickened, their once soft, pale edges now dark and churning. Faint flashes of lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the swirling chaos. Cumulonimbus clouds, Monica thought, her mind already cataloging the potential hazards. She knew the kind of forces at play in such storm systems: unpredictable wind currents, powerful updrafts, and the possibility of severe crosswinds. The plane's autopilot, while advanced, could struggle in such conditions. This was the type of challenge that required the precision of a skilled pilot. Monica took a deep breath, her thoughts racing. The uneven whine of the engines, coupled with the turbulence, hinted at mechanical strain. Years of experience told her something was wrong. Across the aisle, the man in the tailored suit clutched his armrests with white-knuckled intensity. His earlier smugness had been replaced by visible fear. Monica felt a twinge of irony, but quickly dismissed it. Now was not the time for petty satisfaction. A sudden violent jolt sent the plane lurching to one side, eliciting cries from passengers. A tray of drinks toppled over, spilling water and juice onto the carpeted floor. The sound of clattering echoed through the cabin, amplifying the growing tension. Monica leaned forward, her instincts screaming at her to act. She had faced worse in the cockpit, but here, as a passenger, she felt powerless. The only thing separating her from the controls was a door, yet it might as well have been an unscalable wall. Laura appeared at Monica's side, steadying herself against the aisle seats. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Monica replied, her voice calm but firm. "What's the status up there?" Laura hesitated, her professional facade wavering. "The captain and co-pilot are handling the situation. They've rerouted us to avoid the worst of the storm." Monica nodded, though her expression betrayed her skepticism. "I hear the engines straining. Do they know about the imbalance?" Laura blinked, clearly caught off guard by Monica's precise observation. I'm not sure. Monica sighed, her mind already made up. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood carefully, steadying herself as the plane shuddered again. "Ma'am, I need you to remain seated," Laura said, her tone edged with worry. "I understand," Monica replied, her voice steady, "but I also know that sound. It's an engine under strain. I have over 20 years of flight experience, including emergencies like this. If they need help, I can offer it." Laura hesitated, torn between protocol and the weight of Monica's words. Another hard jolt shook the plane, nearly sending Laura off balance. Monica reached out, steadying her with a firm grip. "Please," Monica said quietly, "just let me talk to them." After a moment, Laura relented. "Follow me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Monica followed Laura to the cockpit door, navigating the unsteady aisle with practiced ease. Passengers watched her, their expressions a mixture of fear and curiosity. Whispers followed in her wake, but Monica ignored them. Laura pressed the intercom button by the cockpit door. "Captain Blake," she said, her voice professional, but tinged with urgency. "There's a passenger here requesting to speak with you. She says she's a retired Air Force pilot with experience in handling emergencies." There was a long pause, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of static from the intercom. When the captain's voice finally came through, it was sharp and defensive. "Tell her to return to her seat. We have everything under control." Monica's jaw tightened, but she leaned into the intercom, her tone calm but authoritative. "Captain Blake, this isn't about stepping on your authority. It's about the safety of everyone on board. If you need assistance, I'm here." Another pause. Monica could only imagine the conversation unfolding on the other side of the door. The captain, undoubtedly bristling at the suggestion of outside help, would be weighing his options. Finally, the door hissed open. Captain Blake stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense. His salt and pepper hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Come in," he said curtly, stepping aside. Monica entered the cockpit, her eyes immediately scanning the instruments. The confined space was illuminated by the glow of screens and blinking indicators. The radar display showed a dense mass of storm activity ahead, and the engine panel confirmed her suspicions. One of the engines was running hot, its readings fluctuating dangerously. The co-pilot, a younger man with a pale, tense expression, glanced at Monica with a mix of relief and uncertainty. "Severe crosswinds," Captain Blake said tersely, gesturing to the radar, "and one engine is overcompensating. We're rerouting to avoid the worst of it." Monica nodded, her gaze fixed on the instrument panel. "And the secondary comms?" "Intermittent," the co-pilot said, his voice strained. "We're trying to re-establish a stable connection." Monica leaned closer to the controls, her mind racing as she processed the situation. The airflow sensors might be feeding you bad data. In conditions like this, it happens more often than you'd think. "We've checked," Captain Blake snapped, his tone defensive. Monica met his gaze evenly. "I'm not questioning your competence, Captain. But if the autopilot is overcompensating, you'll need to balance the thrust manually. Otherwise, you're putting more strain on the engines." Blake hesitated, the conflict evident in his expression. Another hard jolt rocked the plane, the nose dipping sharply before stabilizing. The co-pilot glanced at Blake. "Captain, she might be right. The autopilot's adjustments are too erratic. We've already seen a drop in thrust efficiency." Blake exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly. Without a word, he disengaged the autopilot, his hands taking control of the manual settings. Monica pointed to the engine indicators. "Ease up on the number 2 engine and redistribute the load to 3 and 4. They're running cooler." Blake followed her instructions, his movements precise but reluctant. The plane's movements smoothed slightly, the violent jolts replaced by smaller, more manageable vibrations. "Descend slightly," Monica advised, her fingers tracing the weather patterns on the radar. "You'll avoid the stronger wind currents at a lower altitude. It'll give you more control." Blake adjusted the trajectory, the tension in the cockpit beginning to ease. Monica could feel the faintest sense of stability returning, but she knew the storm was far from over. "Good," she said quietly, her voice steady. "Now let's get these people home safely." The cockpit's tension hung as heavily as the storm outside. Captain Blake's hands gripped the controls, his movements precise but noticeably rigid. Beside him, the co-pilot, Ryan Carter, flicked switches and adjusted dials, his posture tense yet more fluid than his captain's. Monica stood behind them, steadying herself against the back of the co-pilot's chair as the plane shuddered under another wave of turbulence. The instruments blinked and whirred, their data streams a chaotic reflection of the storm's intensity. Monica's eyes darted between the readings, her mind piecing together a clearer picture of their predicament. She had been in tighter spots before, but this time the stakes felt different. She wasn't in command. She wasn't behind the controls, and she had never felt more aware of what it meant to be an outsider. "Wind speed increasing," Ryan reported, his voice low and steady. "Crosswinds at 35 knots. Monica stepped forward, her gaze narrowing on the radar display. The storm's edges were lit with faint flashes of lightning, the swirling clouds a mass of shifting grays and blacks. The alternate flight path the captain had chosen skirted the worst of the system, but kept them dangerously close to areas where wind shear could destabilize the plane further. "We need to descend another 1,000 feet, Monica said calmly, pointing to the weather data. "The turbulence is strongest in this band. A lower altitude will stabilize the airflow." Captain Blake's jaw tightened. "We're already at 28,000 feet. Any lower, and we risk fuel inefficiency." "And if you stay here," Monica countered, her tone measured, "you're putting unnecessary strain on the aircraft. Those engines are compensating for the crosswinds, and that imbalance is creeping into critical levels. It's a risk you can't afford." Blake's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flicking between Monica and the controls. Monica could see the war in his mind, his pride battling his instincts. She held his gaze, unwavering but not confrontational. She wasn't here to take over. She was here to help. Ryan broke the silence. "She's got a point, Captain. If we hit a downdraft at this altitude—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Blake exhaled sharply, his shoulders stiff. He adjusted the controls, the plane's nose dipping slightly as they began a gradual descent. Monica felt a subtle shift in the aircraft's movements, the jolts smoothing into softer shudders. "That's better," Monica said, her voice calm but firm. She leaned slightly over the co-pilot's chair, gesturing toward the radar. "Keep monitoring the wind patterns here. You'll see less fluctuation as we stabilize." Blake gave a curt nod, his attention fixed on the instruments. The tension in the cockpit didn't dissipate entirely, but it softened, replaced by a cautious sense of control. As the minutes stretched on, the plane continued its path, navigating the storm's fringes with precision. Monica watched Blake and Ryan work, their coordination efficient despite the unspoken friction. Blake's hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, but Monica could sense the weight of his internal struggle. He wasn't used to sharing authority, especially with someone he hadn't invited into his domain. The plane jolted again, a sudden shift that rattled the cockpit but didn't send them off course. Monica instinctively steadied herself, her grip firm against the co-pilot's chair. "That's just the edge of the updraft," she said, her tone even. "You're holding steady. Good work." Blake didn't respond, but Monica noticed the faintest easing of his shoulders. She let the silence linger, knowing that trust wasn't built with words alone. Actions spoke louder, and the plane's smoother trajectory was proof enough. The intercom crackled, breaking the relative quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake's voice came through, his tone steady but devoid of his earlier bravado. "We've adjusted our altitude to navigate the turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We expect to reach smoother air shortly. Thank you for your patience." Monica glanced at him as he clicked off the mic. His expression was tight, his gaze fixed on the windshield ahead. For a moment, she thought about saying something, but she held back. The captain didn't need more words right now. He needed time to reconcile what had just happened. Instead, Monica turned her attention to Ryan. "What's the status on the secondary comms?" Ryan adjusted a dial, frowning slightly. "Still intermittent. We've re-established contact with the tower, but it keeps dropping. We're using short bursts to relay updates." "Good," Monica said. "Keep it concise. No unnecessary chatter." Ryan nodded, his movements more assured than they had been earlier. Monica could see the difference now, a subtle but noticeable shift in his demeanor. He wasn't just following orders, he was trusting her input. The storm outside began to thin, the clouds losing some of their density as the plane continued its course. The flashes of lightning grew less frequent, and the turbulence eased into a gentle rhythm. Monica allowed herself a small exhale, her body relaxing just slightly. "We're through the worst of it," Ryan said, a hint of relief in his voice. Blake's hands loosened on the controls, though his posture remained stiff. He didn't look at Monica, but his movements spoke volumes. He was listening now, even if he couldn't yet admit it. Monica stepped back, giving the pilots more space. She didn't need to stay much longer. They had found their rhythm, and the plane was back on a stable path. Her work here was done for now. As she turned toward the door, Blake finally spoke. "You've got sharp instincts," he said, his voice low. Monica paused, her hand resting on the door frame. She glanced back, meeting his gaze. There was no warmth in his expression, but there was something else, a flicker of acknowledgement, grudging but genuine. "Comes with the territory," she replied simply. Blake nodded once, his grip tightening on the controls as if to steady himself. Monica didn't push the moment further. She knew better than to expect instant reconciliation. Progress, she had learned, was often slow and uneven, like navigating a storm. She stepped out of the cockpit, the door hissing shut behind her. The first-class cabin was quieter now, the earlier tension replaced by cautious calm. Passengers glanced at her as she walked back to her seat, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Laura approached her as she sat down. "How's it looking?" the flight attendant asked, her voice quiet. "Better," Monica replied, offering a small nod. "We're through the worst of it." Laura's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she gave Monica a faint smile. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Monica shook her head. "They're capable. They just needed a different perspective." As Laura moved down the aisle to assist other passengers, Monica settled back into her seat. She glanced out the window, watching as the storm clouds faded into the distance. For the first time since the turbulence began, Monica allowed herself to relax. She knew this flight was far from over, but for now the skies ahead looked just a little clearer. The cabin lights dimmed as the storm faded into the distance, leaving behind the hum of engines and a collective exhale from the passengers. Monica adjusted her seatbelt, letting her gaze drift to the window. The horizon had softened, the churning gray clouds giving way to streaks of pale blue. Despite the calmer exterior, Monica's mind remained sharp, replaying the events in the cockpit. Captain Blake's begrudging acknowledgement, Ryan's growing confidence, and the uneasy rhythm of their teamwork swirled in her thoughts. She had seen this before, the tension of authority reluctantly shared, and she knew the moments ahead would test their resolve again. The calm was short-lived. Another tremor rippled through the plane, gentler than before, but unmistakable. Monica's attention snapped to the seatbelt sign overhead. It was still illuminated, a precaution she was grateful for. Her instincts told her they weren't entirely out of danger yet. Laura, the flight attendant, moved efficiently down the aisle, checking on passengers. Her earlier nervousness seemed to have ebbed, replaced by a quiet determination. When she reached Monica, she leaned in. "Everything okay?" Monica asked softly, sensing Laura's need to share something. Laura hesitated before responding. "The captain says we're stable for now, but we're running low on time to reach the alternate airport. The storm threw us off course, and the detour is burning more fuel than planned." Monica's brow furrowed. Fuel reserves were always a calculated risk, especially when rerouting. "How's the communication with the tower?" "Still patchy," Laura admitted. "The co-pilot's working on it, but—" She trailed off, her unease apparent. Monica nodded, her mind already assessing the implications. "They'll need to keep their approach precise. Any delays or missteps could put us in a tight spot." Laura gave a faint nod and moved on to the next passenger. Monica's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest as she considered the scenario. A miscalculated glide path, turbulent winds near the runway, or a sudden engine failure could push the situation into a crisis. Her thoughts were interrupted by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for an expedited landing at the alternate airport. The crew will ensure everyone is ready for arrival. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." The tone was calm, but Monica could hear the underlying strain. She glanced at the radar display visible on the overhead monitor, a feature meant to reassure passengers. It showed their descent toward the alternate airport, a small strip of concrete nestled between two expanses of open land. Monica's eyes narrowed. The airport's shorter runway would require precise calculations to manage the landing speed and stopping distance. Combined with the unpredictable winds, it was far from an ideal situation. The plane jolted again, harder this time, drawing startled gasps from the passengers. Monica instinctively steadied herself, her mind racing. She was no stranger to difficult landings, but she wasn't the one behind the controls this time. That vulnerability gnawed at her. Laura returned to her side, crouching slightly to meet Monica's eyes. "They might need you again," she said quietly. "I can feel it. The turbulence is picking up, and people are starting to panic." Monica glanced around the cabin. Whispers rippled through the rows, a mix of hushed reassurances and rising anxiety. A child in the economy section began to cry, the sound sharp and cutting. "I'll go back up," Monica said firmly, unbuckling her seatbelt. This time there was no resistance. Laura stepped aside, and Monica steadied herself as she made her way to the cockpit door. The plane jolted sharply again, but Monica's stride remained steady, her years of training guiding her through the unsteady air. When she reached the cockpit, she knocked firmly. The intercom crackled as Laura's voice broke through. "Captain, she's here again!" After a pause, the door hissed open. Captain Blake's expression was grim, his tension palpable. Ryan glanced at Monica, his relief barely concealed. "We're in trouble," Ryan admitted, his voice taut. "Fuel's dipping below the safe threshold, and the winds near the runway are gusting higher than predicted. Comms are intermittent, and we're trying to coordinate the landing as best we can." Monica stepped into the cockpit, her sharp eyes scanning the instruments. The radar showed their approach, but the data was flickering, unreliable. The engine indicators revealed a troubling imbalance, one engine running hotter than the others. "Your engine imbalance is going to complicate your landing speed," Monica said, pointing to the readings. "You need to stabilize that before you hit the glide path." Blake's hands tightened on the controls, his expression dark. "I've got it under control." Monica met his gaze, her voice steady but unyielding. "This isn't the time for pride, Captain. Let me help you make this work." Blake hesitated, his jaw clenched. Another sharp gust rocked the plane, drawing a warning beep from the instruments. Ryan turned to him. "Captain, she's right. We need to work together." Blake exhaled sharply, then gave a terse nod. "What's your plan?" Monica stepped closer, pointing to the radar. "Ease up on engine 2 and distribute the load across 3 and 4. "You're descending too fast. Adjust the flaps to slow it down gradually. The winds near the runway are gusting from the south, so you'll need to angle the nose slightly to the left to compensate." Blake followed her instructions, his movements precise but strained. Monica could feel the weight of his internal struggle, but she didn't push him further. Instead, she focused on the instruments, offering quiet guidance when needed. The plane dipped lower, the runway now visible in the distance. The passengers below were silent, the earlier murmurs replaced by a tense stillness. Monica could feel the collective weight of their fear pressing against her, but she didn't let it show. "Coming up on the glide path," Ryan said, his voice tight. Monica leaned forward, her eyes locked on the instruments. "Keep your descent shallow. You've got crosswinds to fight, and a steep approach will make it harder to stabilize." Blake's hands tightened on the controls, his jaw set. The plane shuddered as it hit a pocket of turbulent air, but he adjusted smoothly, the nose dipping slightly to align with the runway. "Landing gear down," Ryan called out. Monica watched as the gears deployed with a faint whine, the plane shuddering slightly. The runway loomed closer, its lights a faint beacon in the growing dusk. "Steady," Monica murmured, her voice calm but firm. Blake didn't respond, but his focus was razor-sharp. The plane dipped lower, the winds buffeting it from all sides. Monica felt the subtle shifts in pressure, her body instinctively aligning with the movements. The tires screeched against the runway, the plane jolting as it made contact. Blake engaged the brakes, his hands steady on the controls. The aircraft slowed, its momentum easing as it rolled to a stop near the end of the strip. A collective sigh of relief filled the cabin, followed by scattered applause from the passengers. Monica leaned back, her body relaxing for the first time since she entered the cockpit. Blake exhaled, his shoulders slumping. Ryan turned to Monica, his expression a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "Thanks," he said quietly. Monica nodded, her gaze steady. "You both did well." This wasn't easy. Blake didn't say anything, but his tight expression had softened slightly. Monica didn't need his words. The safe landing was thanks enough. As the plane rolled to a stop, the first hints of rain began to streak the windows. Monica glanced outside, her mind already shifting to the next steps. The flight was over, but the journey was far from finished. The plane came to a halt on the rain-slicked tarmac, its engines whining softly as they powered down. Monica remained in the cockpit for a moment, steadying herself against the lingering hum of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Outside, emergency vehicles with flashing lights lined the edges of the runway, their presence a stark reminder of how close this flight had come to catastrophe. Captain Blake sat rigid in his seat, his hands still gripping the controls. His face was pale, a fine sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. He exhaled sharply, releasing a breath he seemed to have held since the plane touched down. Next to him, Ryan slumped in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features. Monica broke the silence. "The hardest part is over, but there's still work to do. You'll need a full report ready for the ground crew. Make sure they check the engines thoroughly." Blake didn't respond immediately. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "Noted." His tone was flat, but Monica could hear the strain beneath it. She gave a small nod, deciding to leave it at that. This wasn't the moment to press him further. Instead, she turned to Ryan, offering him a faint smile. "You kept your head when it mattered. Good job." Ryan's expression brightened slightly, his shoulders relaxing. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but genuine. Monica straightened and moved toward the cockpit door. Before stepping out, she turned back to Blake. "You brought this plane down safely. That's what counts. Remember that." Blake's eyes flicked to her briefly, something unreadable flashing across his face. He gave a curt nod but said nothing. The cabin was filled with a quiet buzz as passengers began gathering their belongings. The earlier fear and tension had given way to a palpable sense of relief. Whispers and murmurs rippled through the rows, some voices carrying notes of gratitude, others of disbelief at what they had just experienced. Monica made her way down the aisle, her movements unhurried. Passengers turned to look at her, their eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity and awe. She felt their gazes, but didn't linger on them. She was used to being the center of attention in moments like these, moments where action spoke louder than explanations. As she reached her seat, the man in the tailored suit across the aisle leaned forward, his earlier confidence replaced by an almost sheepish expression. "Excuse me," he began, his voice hesitant. You were in the cockpit, right?" Monica glanced at him, her expression neutral. "Yes." He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before returning to hers. I didn't know you were a pilot." Monica's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "You didn't ask." The man blinked, his cheeks reddening. "Right. Well, thank you for whatever you did up there." Monica nodded, not unkindly. "You're welcome." She retrieved her bag and turned to leave, her steps deliberate as she walked toward the exit. Her focus was on the door ahead, the cool night air visible through the open hatch. She had no time for explanations or apologies. What mattered was that everyone on board was safe. On the tarmac, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the asphalt glistening under the bright airport lights. Emergency crews bustled around the aircraft, their reflective vests catching flashes of red and blue from the nearby vehicles. Monica inhaled deeply, the cool air a welcome reprieve after the stifling tension inside the plane. A small group of airline officials stood near the base of the stairs, their expressions tight with concern. One of them, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a name tag that read Riley Regional Manager, stepped forward as Monica approached. "Ms. Reynolds?" Riley asked, her tone both questioning and respectful. "That's me," Monica replied, adjusting the strap of her bag. "We've been informed that you assisted the crew during the flight," Riley said, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "On behalf of the airline, I want to thank you for stepping in. Your expertise clearly made a difference." Monica offered a polite nod. "I did what needed to be done." Riley hesitated for a moment, then continued. "We'd like to debrief you along with the crew, if you're willing. It won't take long, but it's important we document everything." "Of course," Monica said. "Lead the way." The debrief took place in a small conference room within the airport terminal. The walls were bare, and the fluorescent lighting cast a harsh glare over the polished table. Monica sat across from Captain Blake and Ryan, while Riley stood at the head of the table with a tablet in hand. Riley got straight to the point. "Captain Blake, let's start with your assessment of the situation." Blake cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "The turbulence was worse than expected," he began, his voice carefully measured. "We encountered significant crosswinds and engine strain." Ms. Reynolds provided input during a critical moment. Monica raised an eyebrow at the phrasing, but stayed silent, letting him continue. "She demonstrated a strong understanding of the challenges we were facing," Blake admitted, though his words carried a hint of reluctance. "Her experience was evident." Riley nodded thoughtfully before turning to Monica. "Ms. Reynolds, do you have anything to add?" Monica leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "I stepped in because it was clear the situation was escalating. My priority was the safety of everyone on board. I respect Captain Blake's authority, but in moments like that, collaboration is key." Riley studied her for a moment, then turned back to Blake. "Captain, do you feel her involvement was warranted?" There was a long pause. Blake's jaw tightened, and his gaze dropped to the table. Finally, he exhaled sharply and spoke. "Yes, she was right." The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Monica didn't gloat or press the point. She simply nodded, her composure unshaken. "Thank you, Captain," Riley said, her tone brisk but not unkind. She turned to Monica. "Ms. Reynolds, your actions were exemplary. We'll ensure this incident is documented appropriately." The meeting concluded shortly after. Monica rose from her seat, feeling the weight of the evening begin to lift. She didn't need validation from anyone in the room, but the acknowledgement felt like a small victory nonetheless. As Monica stepped back into the terminal, the rain had stopped completely. The lights from the tarmac cast a warm glow on the windows, their reflections shimmering on the polished floor. She paused for a moment, taking in the quiet stillness of the night. Kindness had been a scarce commodity on this journey, but it had found her in small, unexpected moments. Laura's genuine concern, Ryan's willingness to trust her, and even the reluctant respect from Captain Blake. These moments, however fleeting, reminded her of the power of connection, even in the most turbulent of circumstances. Monica adjusted her bag and began walking toward the lounge. The journey wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of clarity. She had faced storms before, and she had learned how to rise above them not alone, but with the help of others. And she knew as she walked through the terminal that she was stronger for it. Monica settled into one of the stiff leather chairs in the terminal lounge, her duffel bag resting at her feet. The muted lighting and faint hum of distant conversations offered a semblance of calm after the chaos of the flight. She leaned back, exhaling slowly as the weight of the evening began to settle over her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the storm was ebbing, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. The lounge was sparsely occupied. A businessman spoke softly into his phone, his words blending into the background noise. A young couple dozed in a corner, their luggage piled beside them. Monica watched absently, her thoughts drifting. Despite the acknowledgement she had received during the debrief, the journey to this point had been far from smooth. The doubts, the silent judgments, and the weight of always having to prove herself, it all lingered like a shadow, even in her moments of triumph. She thought back to Captain Blake's begrudging admission in the conference room. It was a step forward, but it wasn't closure. His acknowledgement felt more like a concession than a genuine shift in perspective. Still, Monica reminded herself that progress often came in small steps, not leaps. Her reverie was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned slightly, her eyes landing on Blake as he entered the lounge. His uniform was still immaculate, though his posture was less rigid than it had been earlier. His gaze swept the room before settling on her. Monica raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he approached. Blake hesitated for a moment, then gestured to the chair opposite her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice quieter than she expected. She nodded, gesturing to the seat. "Go ahead." Blake lowered himself into the chair, his movements deliberate. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with unspoken thoughts. "I wanted to thank you," Blake said finally, his tone measured, "for what you did up there." Monica regarded him carefully, her expression unreadable. "You already did." Blake exhaled, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Not properly," he admitted. "I've been thinking about it, about the flight, the landing, everything. You stepped in when you didn't have to, and you did it knowing I wasn't exactly welcoming." Monica's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "That's one way to put it." Blake glanced at her, his expression faintly sheepish. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming with visible effort. "About you, about how I handled things. You knew what you were doing, and I let my pride get in the way." Monica leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Why do you think that is?" Blake hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I've always prided myself on being in control, on being the one who knows what to do in any situation. But tonight—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Tonight showed me how much I still have to learn." Monica nodded slowly. Leadership isn't about having all the answers, she said. It's about knowing when to trust the people around you, when to listen. Blake met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. I didn't give you that trust, and I should have. You earned it 100 times over, but I didn't see it. That's a start, Monica said, her tone neutral, but not unkind. Blake leaned back, his shoulders slumping slightly. How do you do it? He asked after a moment. Stay so composed under pressure? Keep your head when everything's going wrong? Monica's expression softened. I spent 20 years in the Air Force, flying missions where every decision mattered. You learn quickly that panic doesn't solve anything. Composure does. Blake nodded, absorbing her words. Fighter jets, right? Mostly, Monica confirmed. But I've flown all kinds of aircraft. Combat, transport, reconnaissance. They all taught me the same thing. Teamwork is what gets you through. Blake's lips pressed into a thin line. I've always thought of myself as a good leader, he said quietly. But tonight, I saw my limits. And I realized how much I've let my assumptions get in the way. Monica studied him for a moment, then said, Assumptions are dangerous, Captain. In the air, they can get people killed. Down here, they close doors that should never have been shut. Her words hung in the air, heavy but necessary. Blake nodded slowly, the weight of her message settling over him. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I need to do better. Monica's gaze softened. You can, she said, if you're willing to listen and learn. Blake exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I am, he said simply. The conversation drifted after that, the initial tension giving way to a quieter exchange. Blake asked about her Air Force career, and Monica shared a few stories, not the harrowing ones, but moments that highlighted the camaraderie and resilience she had experienced. Blake, in turn, shared his own struggles as a commercial pilot, the pressures of command, the constant balancing act of authority and accountability. For the first time, they spoke not as adversaries, but as peers. As the hours stretched on, the airport began to stir with the early signs of morning. Travelers trickled into the terminal, their footsteps echoing in the quiet space. Monica glanced at her watch, realizing how much time had passed. I should get going, she said, rising from her seat. Blake stood as well, extending a hand. His grip was firm but respectful. Thank you, Ms. Reynolds, he said, his tone sincere. Not just for tonight, but for giving me something to think about. Monica shook his hand, her expression calm. Take it to heart, Captain. Every flight is a chance to do better. Blake nodded, her words settling over him like a quiet promise. As Monica walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the terminal's glow, Blake remained by the window, watching the tarmac. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground glistening under the soft lights. Tonight had been a reckoning not just with the storm outside, but with the one inside himself. And as he stood there, the echoes of Monica's words still fresh in his mind, he made a silent vow. The man who had hesitated in the cockpit tonight would not be the same man to step into it tomorrow. Monica stepped out of the terminal and into the brisk morning air. The rain had cleared, leaving behind a cool, refreshing scent that mingled with the faint hum of distant engines. Her duffel bag hung lightly over her shoulder as she walked toward the curb, her thoughts as steady as her stride. The night had been turbulent in more ways than one, but the morning carried with it a quiet sense of resolution. A rideshare car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. Monica slid into the back seat, giving the driver a polite nod before settling in. As the city skyline blurred past the windows, her mind drifted to the conversation with Captain Blake. His admission, though reluctant, had been genuine. She could still see the uncertainty in his eyes, the weight of his realization pressing against him like a persistent storm cloud. She wasn't sure if their paths would cross again, but she hoped he'd carry the lesson forward. growth was rarely immediate. It was a gradual process, shaped by moments like these. By the time Monica reached her sister's house in suburban Boston, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. The streets were lined with neat rows of trees, their leaves glistening from the rain. A small smile tugged at Monica's lips as she climbed the porch steps and knocked softly on the door. Her sister Rachel opened it moments later, her face lighting up with a mixture of relief and excitement. "You're here," Rachel said, pulling Monica into a warm embrace. "Come in. You must be exhausted." "A little," Monica admitted, stepping inside. The familiar scent of brewed coffee and cinnamon greeted her, instantly making her feel at home. Olivia, Rachel's 8-year-old daughter, peeked around the corner, her eyes widening when she saw Monica. "Auntie Mo!" she squealed, darting forward to hug her. Monica crouched down, wrapping her arms around Olivia. "Hey, sweetheart. I missed you." "I missed you too," Olivia said, her face beaming. "Are you staying for breakfast?" Monica chuckled. "You bet I am. What's on the menu?" "Pancakes," Olivia declared, grabbing Monica's hand to lead her to the kitchen. As Rachel busied herself at the stove, Monica settled at the table, watching her niece chatter excitedly about school, friends, and her latest favorite books. The warmth of family filled the room, a stark contrast to the tension of the flight. Later that morning, after Olivia had run off to play, Rachel poured Monica another cup of coffee and sat across from her. "You look different," Rachel said, studying her sister. "Like something's shifted." Monica raised an eyebrow. "That obvious?" Rachel smiled knowingly. "You've always carried a certain weight on your shoulders, but today you seem lighter." "What happened?" Monica hesitated, then shared the story of the flight, the turbulence, the cockpit, and her interaction with Captain Blake. She spoke calmly, detailing the moments that had tested her composure and the unexpected connections that had emerged. When she finished, Rachel leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Sounds like you made quite an impact." "It wasn't just me," Monica said, shaking her head. "Blake may have been stubborn, but he listened in the end. And Laura, the flight attendant, she showed real kindness. Those small gestures, trust, understanding, they made all the difference." Rachel nodded. "It's amazing how much a little kindness can do, especially in moments of crisis." Monica smiled faintly, her sister's words resonating deeply. She had spent so much of her life proving herself, pushing through barriers, and fighting to be seen. But this experience had reminded her of something just as important: the power of connection. That afternoon, as Olivia played in the backyard, Monica found herself flipping through an old journal she had brought along. The pages were filled with notes and sketches from her Air Force days, a mix of technical insights and personal reflections. She paused on one entry, written during a particularly challenging deployment. "Leadership isn't about commanding attention. It's about earning trust. The team succeeds because we succeed together." The words felt as relevant now as they had back then. Monica closed the journal, her thoughts swirling. She pulled out her phone and opened a message from a local mentorship program she had been considering. It was an organization that paired experienced pilots with aspiring ones, offering guidance and support to those navigating the challenges of the aviation industry. Monica had hesitated to commit, unsure if she was ready to take on the responsibility. But now, after everything that had happened, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Without overthinking it, she tapped the screen and began typing. "I'd like to get involved. Let me know how I can help." Across the city, Captain Blake sat at his desk, a steaming cup of coffee beside him. The debrief from the night's flight sat open on his laptop, the words a stark reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Blake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His thoughts kept returning to Monica, her calm confidence, her ability to take control without undermining his authority, and the way she had handled the entire situation with grace, He had spent much of his career striving to be the kind of leader others looked up to, but the events of the night had exposed cracks in his foundation. Monica had shown him what true leadership looked like, and now it was up to him to do something about it. Blake opened his email and began drafting a message to his airline's training division. "I'd like to propose a new leadership module for our pilot training program. We need to focus more on collaboration, trust, and adaptability in high-pressure situations." As he typed, he made a silent promise to himself. He would carry the lessons of that flight forward, not just as a captain, but as a leader and a mentor. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Monica sat on the porch with Rachel, a cup of tea warming her hands. The air was crisp, the distant sound of cicadas filling the silence. "You think you'll see him again?" Rachel asked, her tone curious. "Blake?" Monica said, shrugging slightly. "Maybe, but whether I do or not, I hope he remembers what he learned. That's all that matters." Rachel nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "You have a way of leaving an impression, Mo, whether people realize it or not." Monica chuckled softly. "Maybe, but sometimes it's the people who leave an impression on me that matter more." As she sipped her tea, Monica felt a sense of quiet resolve. The storm had tested her, but it had also given her clarity. Kindness, trust, and connection, they weren't just tools for survival. They were the foundation of something greater. And as she looked out at the fading light, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Monica found herself at her sister's kitchen table once again, this time with her laptop open and a steaming cup of coffee beside her. Olivia sat across from her, coloring intently, the tip of her tongue poking out as she concentrated. Rachel flitted around the kitchen, preparing breakfast, while humming softly to herself. Monica stared at her screen, her inbox filling with responses to the message she'd sent to the mentorship program the day before. The enthusiasm from the program coordinators was evident in their replies, each one expressing excitement about the prospect of having a seasoned pilot like Monica on board. "Are you going to do it?" Rachel asked, setting a plate of toast and eggs in front of her. Monica nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "I think so. It feels right. It's time to pass on what I've learned." Rachel slid into the chair beside her, a cup of tea in hand. "You've always been a natural mentor. Even when we were kids, you were the one everyone came to for advice." Monica chuckled, shaking her head. "I don't know about that." Rachel gave her a knowing look. "Trust me, you've got more to offer than you realize." That afternoon, Monica finalized her commitment to the mentorship program, scheduling an orientation session for the following week. The program focused on preparing young pilots, many of them women and people from underrepresented backgrounds, for the challenges of the aviation industry. The thought of working with aspiring pilots filled Monica with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent so much of her career breaking through barriers, often feeling like she was navigating the skies alone. Now, she had the chance to make sure others didn't have to. Meanwhile, Captain Blake was beginning his own journey of reflection and growth. Back in his apartment, he reviewed his proposal for the airline's leadership training module, fine-tuning the details before submitting it to the training division. Blake had always been meticulous, but this time, his work felt personal. He wanted to ensure that the next generation of pilots wouldn't just be skilled at flying planes, but also adept at building trust and fostering collaboration. He thought of Monica often, her calm presence in the cockpit, and her unwavering focus on the safety of everyone on board. Her words echoed in his mind. Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing when to trust the people around you. Blake knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt ready to take the necessary steps. A week later, Monica arrived at the mentorship program's headquarters, a modest but welcoming office space in downtown Boston. The walls were lined with photos of successful mentees, pilots who had gone on to achieve their dreams of soaring through the skies. The program director, a spirited woman named Danielle, greeted Monica warmly. "Monica Reynolds," Danielle said, shaking her hand firmly. "I've heard so much about you. Thank you for joining us. We're lucky to have you." "I'm excited to be here," Monica replied, her tone genuine. Danielle led her into a conference room where a group of new mentors had gathered for orientation. The atmosphere was charged with energy and enthusiasm, and Monica felt herself feeding off it. As the session began, Danielle spoke passionately about the program's mission: to empower young pilots and provide them with the tools and support they needed to succeed. Monica listened intently, taking in every detail. She couldn't help but think back to her early days as a pilot, when mentors had been few and far between. If programs like this had existed back then, how much easier might her journey have been? Over the next few weeks, Monica began working closely with her assigned mentees. Among them was a young woman named Elena Cruz, a driven and ambitious pilot in training who reminded Monica of her younger self. Elena was sharp and eager to learn, but Monica quickly noticed the subtle insecurities that crept into her voice when she talked about her experiences in training. "They don't say it outright," Elena confided during one of their sessions, "but I can feel it. The way they look at me, the way they second-guess my decisions. It's like they're waiting for me to prove I don't belong." Monica's chest tightened at the familiar words. "I've been there," she said gently. "But you belong, Elena, and it's not your job to carry the weight of their assumptions. Let your work speak for itself, and when you need help, don't be afraid to ask for it." Elena nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "I'll remember that." Across the country, Captain Blake was seeing the first signs of change within his airline. His proposal had been approved, and the new leadership training module was being rolled out to pilots at all levels. Blake himself had volunteered to lead some of the sessions, sharing his own experiences and emphasizing the importance of trust and adaptability. During one session, a young co-pilot asked him, "What made you change your perspective, Captain?" Blake hesitated for a moment, then said, "I learned it the hard way. I was lucky enough to have someone show me what leadership really looks like. And I realized I had a responsibility to do better for my crew, for my passengers, and for myself." His words resonated with the group, sparking thoughtful discussion and reflection. Months passed, and both Monica and Blake found themselves transformed by their experiences. Monica's work with the mentorship program grew deeper, her connections with her mentees inspiring her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Blake, meanwhile, continued to challenge himself, both as a pilot and as a leader. He began fostering a more inclusive and collaborative environment within his airline, earning the respect of his colleagues in new ways. One evening, Monica received an email from Blake. "Hi, Monica. I just wanted to let you know that the leadership module we talked about has been a success. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and I owe a lot of that to you. Thank you for showing me the kind of leader I want to be." Monica smiled as she read the message, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of fulfillment. Her reply was simple but heartfelt. "Hi, Blake. That's wonderful to hear. Every flight is a chance to do better, and it sounds like you're taking that to heart. Keep it up." As Monica closed her laptop, she felt a deep sense of connection, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating change in ways she never could have imagined. Monica stood at the podium, her gaze sweeping over the room filled with aspiring pilots, aviation professionals, and industry leaders. The annual Wings of Tomorrow conference had invited her to deliver the keynote address, a surprise she had almost turned down. But as she had read the email, a quiet determination had taken hold of her. This was an opportunity not just to share her story, but to inspire others, an extension of the work she had been doing through the mentorship program. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, the weight of 100 expectant faces pressing gently against her. Monica took a steadying breath, her calm demeanor masking the faint flutter of nerves in her chest. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice even but warm. "When I first received the invitation to speak here, I wasn't sure what I could offer that you hadn't already heard. The aviation world is full of stories, stories of triumph, innovation, and resilience. But as I thought about it, I realized what I want to share isn't just about flying. It's about the people who help us soar." A faint murmur rippled through the audience, their attention sharpening. "I spent 2 decades in the Air Force," Monica continued, "flying missions in some of the toughest conditions imaginable. But the greatest lessons I learned weren't just about aerodynamics or navigation. They were about leadership, trust, and the power of collaboration. Those lessons became the foundation of my career, and they're the reason I'm standing here today." She paused, her thoughts briefly drifting to the turbulent flight that had brought her here, figuratively and literally. "I want to tell you about a flight I was on not too long ago," she said, her voice softening. "It was supposed to be a routine trip, just another connection in the web of commercial aviation. But turbulence doesn't care about routine." A few smiles and nods rippled through the audience. Monica smiled faintly, drawing them in. "What happened on that flight tested me in ways I hadn't expected. It tested my patience, my resolve, and my ability to lead from the shadows. But it also showed me something powerful: the ripple effect of trust and kindness. From a flight attendant who saw more in me than a passenger, to a captain who found the courage to admit his own limits, that flight reminded me of the strength we have when we choose to work together." Her words hung in the air, resonating with the crowd. Monica let the silence settle before continuing. "As pilots, we're taught to rely on checklists, protocols, and instruments. But the most important tool in any cockpit isn't a system, it's the people. The ones who challenge us, support us, and sometimes push us to see beyond our own assumptions." In the back of the room, Captain Richard Blake listened intently, his posture unusually relaxed. He hadn't expected to see Monica again so soon, but when he'd learned she was speaking at the conference, he'd rearranged his schedule to attend. Blake wasn't the same man who had hesitated in the cockpit that night. The months since had been transformative, filled with self-reflection and deliberate growth. Monica's words, both then and now, had stayed with him, guiding his steps. As Monica continued speaking, Blake noticed the way the audience leaned into her story, captivated by her steady confidence. She wasn't just sharing a moment from her life, she was planting seeds of change, one word at a time. Monica wrapped up her speech with a quiet but powerful message. Every flight is a chance to do better, to rise above the turbulence, to trust the people around you, and to remember that leadership isn't about control, it's about connection. Whether you're in the cockpit, the control tower, or anywhere else in life, that's what will carry you forward. The room erupted into applause, the sound filling the space like a wave. Monica stepped back from the podium, a faint smile on her lips. She hadn't expected this moment to feel so profound, but it did. After the event, attendees gathered in the lobby for a networking session. Monica stood near a window, a glass of water in hand, as a steady stream of people approached her to thank her for her words. "Your story really resonated with me," one young pilot said. "I've been struggling with confidence during training, but hearing about your journey reminded me why I started in the first place." Monica smiled warmly. "That confidence comes with time and experience. Trust yourself, and don't be afraid to lean on others when you need to. None of us get there alone." As the crowd thinned, Monica turned to see Blake approaching. He wore his uniform, the stripes on his sleeves catching the light. His expression was calm but thoughtful, a far cry from the defensive tension she had seen in him before. "Captain Blake," she said, extending a hand. "Ms. Reynolds," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. "I didn't expect to see you here," Monica said, her tone light. "I wouldn't have missed it," Blake admitted. "Your speech, It hit home, more than I expected. Monica tilted her head slightly, studying him. How's it been, since the flight? Blake exhaled, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Different. Better. I've been putting your words into practice: trust, collaboration, adaptability. It's not easy, but it's worth it. It always is, Monica said. Blake hesitated, then added, You were right about assumptions. They close doors that should never be shut. I've been working to change that, not just for myself, but for the people I lead. Monica's smile softened. That's good to hear. Every step matters. Blake nodded, his respect for her clear. Thank you, Monica, for everything. You've had more of an impact than you realize. Monica's gaze shifted to the horizon outside the window, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold. Maybe, she said, her voice thoughtful, but it's people like you who carry it forward. That's what really matters. Blake followed her gaze, a quiet sense of understanding passing between them. As Monica left the conference that evening, she felt lighter, as though the weight of her journey had been lifted slightly. The storm she had faced months ago had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also given her clarity and purpose. She thought of Elena, her mentee, and the countless others she had yet to meet. The work wasn't over, it never would be, but that was the beauty of it. Each interaction, each connection, was another chance to inspire, to grow, and to soar. And as she stepped into the cool night air, Monica felt certain of one thing. The skies ahead were boundless, filled with infinite possibilities. Monica walked out into the crisp night air, the faint hum of the city blending with the echoes of the applause still fresh in her mind. The journey that had brought her here was one of turbulence and triumph, of resilience and connection. She knew this was just the beginning. For every story she had shared, there were countless others waiting to unfold stories of perseverance, growth, and the quiet, transformative power of kindness. The world was full of opportunities to rise above the clouds, to trust in the people around you, and to make a difference, no matter how small the gesture. Each day brought a new flight to embark on, a new horizon to reach. Thank you for being part of this journey. If Monica's story inspired you, don't miss the chance to be part of more powerful and uplifting tales. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about resilience, kindness, and hope. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Like and share this story with someone who could use a reminder of the strength within them. Let's keep soaring higher together.